Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining. Thanks for bearing with us there. We just gave ourselves a bit more time for people to join as we know we've got a lot of people signed up for the webinar today. I'm Sophie. I'm a Principal Communication Strategist at Frameworks UK, and we've been partnering with JRF and the Nationwide Foundation to identify different ways that we can all communicate about housing in the UK, all to help improve people's understanding, the quality of discussion and debate, and ultimately lead to positive changes in our housing system. You might have joined one of our previous webinars, or maybe you've come to a workshop with us looking at how we can all tell a new story about homes in the UK. You might be new to all of this, and regardless of how much you've engaged with this so far, I think you should all have something helpful to take away from today. So today we're going to be focusing on how we can join up insights from two different but intertwined issues, both homes and poverty. And we're going to look at how we can essentially add to the recommendations in our Talking About Homes toolkit, with recommendations informed by our previous work with JRF on talking about poverty, as well as some insights that are really hot off the press from our latest research report from our Moving Mindsets programme. Before we get started, just a few bits of housekeeping. So we are recording today's session. So if you get cut off at any point, you'll be able to catch up on that. Or if you have any colleagues who couldn't make it today, you'll be able to share the recording with them. We also have recordings of our previous webinars, which you can find on JRF's YouTube channel, and also most of them are on the Frameworks UK website. So do catch up if there's any that you've missed that you'd like to watch. You'll notice that you're all muted, you all have your cameras off, and it'll be that way for the duration of today because we're set up as a webinar because there's quite a lot of you joining. So just to reassure you, that's totally normal. There are no technical issues at your end. We won't be sharing a PDF of today's slides, but we do have various resources for you that will have everything you need. We will pop links to those in the chat as we go through today, as well as sharing any pertinent things in a follow-up email after the webinar. I'll be joined later on by my colleague Kate for the Q&A, and Natalie from JRF is also managing our Q&A box today. If you have any questions as we go through today, do pop those in the Q&A box and we'll answer as many as we can at the end of the session. I'm going to be speaking for roughly 40 minutes, then we'll move into that Q&A. And I think you can also upvote each other's questions if somebody else has already asked something you'd like to know the answer to. Lastly, please feel free to add your organisation's name to your Zoom name, as it just means that when we get to the Q&A, it's really helpful for us to see who's joining us from where when we get to taking those questions. Now, without further ado, I'll get started. So first of all, just a little bit about Frameworks UK in case anybody hasn't met us before. We are a not-for-profit and we specialise in evidence-based communication strategies, all designed to shift hearts and minds. So this means we mostly work with charities and other mission-driven organisations to communicate about different social issues in ways that will be helpful for creating progress. And we do this through practical communications guidance that's all underpinned by our framing research. I'll say a little bit more about this shortly, but Frameworks research essentially shows how people understand different social issues. It tells us not just what people think, but why we all think and reason in the ways that we do. And then we use that knowledge to develop and test different communications approaches that will be helpful in achieving lasting change that we all want to see. This is just an illustration of some of the organisations we've worked with in the UK recently. So you'll be able to gather from this that we focus mostly, but not exclusively, on issues around children and families, homes, of course, poverty, of course, and also health. So this means we have a really solid research base, which I'll be drawing on for today's session, with our research on homes, homelessness, poverty and health in particular. Now, all of these resources listed here are available on our website if you'd like to dig into any more detail on the research. In each case, our research has included both qualitative and quantitative testing through a combination of large-scale nationally representative surveys, interviews, and peer discourse sessions, which are a type of focus group where we can test the use of new frames in a conversational setting. I'll also be drawing today from our latest Moving Mindsets report, which we published just last week, so this really is very fresh. So Moving Mindsets is a pilot program that we've been running, supported by JRF and the Health Foundation. Essentially, throughout 2024, we tracked public thinking on social issues across the 4 nations of the UK. And this included a first of its kind survey designed to track how mindsets on poverty and health are shifting. So I've got a bit of a juicy finding from that to share with you in a bit. So today, I'll start with just a sort of intro or a recap on what framing is, why it matters to our work. Then we'll look at how people think about homes, and in particular, how people think about poverty as well, to sort of set the scene before we get into how we can add to our story with insights from our research on talking about poverty. So that, when you're talking about homes and talking about poverty, you will now have an even more complete toolkit to draw from to help you communicate. And as I said, we'll make sure we've got time, hopefully the last sort of 20 minutes or so, for any questions you may have. So first of all, what is framing? Why does it matter? And I think it's helpful to start with a shared definition. Framing is essentially the choices we make about what ideas we share and how we share them. So this includes choices that we make every day, such as what we emphasize, how we explain an issue, and the things we might choose to leave unsaid. And framing matters because these choices can lead to really radical changes in how people think, feel, and act. Now, all of us are framing all of the time, but when we make these decisions deliberately and ideally backed up by evidence, we can make them with much more confidence that our communications are landing as we intend them to, that we're building the understanding that we want to build. And I'm going to start by sharing a couple of examples to illustrate the difference that framing can make. Now, first of all, this is a study that's taken from an American study from 2011, and 2 groups were shown different excerpts which used different metaphors to frame the issue of crime. So one group were shown this first statement, which said, "Crime is a wild beast preying on the city of Addison, and the crime rate in the once peaceful city has steadily increased over the past 3 years." The second statement was nearly identical, but it used this metaphor of crime is a virus infecting the city of Addison. So very similar statements, but drawing on different metaphors to try and make their points. Now, what the study found was that the crime as beast metaphor led to 74% favour for tougher policing, prison and punishment. Whereas those who saw the crime as virus metaphor, well, this decreased that support for more tough enforcement to 56%. And instead, it actually increased their support for more progressive reforms, what we might consider a public health approach to tackling crime. So what the researchers saw here was that a change in metaphor amounting to just a few words dramatically shifted the type of policies that people were willing to support. What they saw was that how people were primed to think really changed how they understood the issue in front of them and how they reasoned about it, what solutions they thought would be needed. So this sort of framing choice matters. It really can shape how issues are seen and understood, and in turn shape the sort of real life solutions that people are likely to support. Looking now at another example, this time from our own research. This is taken from the research we did on JRF on how to talk about poverty, which we'll be drawing on today. And this is what happened when we tested arguments which were based on the number of people in poverty versus the same data, but adding this value of compassion to the writing that people were seeing. So it was framed for this value of compassion as well as talking about the number of people in poverty. So we had a control group that's represented here by that solid black line along the 0 x-axis. Anything above this essentially represents an improvement, an increase in support for the idea that poverty matters, that we have a responsibility to act, and that action will actually make a difference. And what we saw was that the argument based on data alone didn't have any statistically significant change compared to the control. You can see those red bars there. Some are very, very low, and even the highest one is not enough that we would consider significant. We might as well have said nothing at all. Whereas the data which was combined with an appeal to compassion, the people who saw that as the stimulus, well, this led to a significant shift in people's responses, which was great and what we wanted to see, and why we then recommended that as one of the framing recommendations in our toolkit with JRF. Now I'm going to show you an example of what can happen when we reframe the conversation on a given issue, what that can look like in an actual conversation with a fellow human being. And this is taken from our work on framing children's health and obesity in the UK. I'm going to show you a couple of clips here, and in between them, this woman was read a short, well-framed paragraph that used some of the framing principles that we had identified through our research. This included a tested metaphor, which we'll see referred to. But I basically want you to take a look and see what happened. So who would you say is responsible for taking action to reduce childhood obesity?
Possibly the parents, but maybe the government as well needs to educate, a bit more education to the parents, not necessarily to the children. They don't have much of a choice depending on what age child.
What does that make you think about?
It could be a lot more accessible, especially in like the smaller supermarkets. If you want to buy like fruit and veg in the supermarket, smaller supermarkets, it's all packaged and it's far more expensive than in a large supermarket, which is less accessible to people.
Who should do that? Who can make those changes?
Well, the supermarkets could not be bleeding people dry in the smaller supermarket, in the more convenient shops, making it more expensive. But again, if they get away with it, they'll do what they want to make as much money as they can. So someone, again, going back to the government, could be doing something to persuade them to make healthier food accessible to all.
So what we saw there was that this woman essentially went from a default of changing individuals' behaviour through education, that being the solution, to instead looking at how healthy food could be made more affordable and more accessible. So this shift from individuals to the context that shapes our health. And this shift from individuals to context is exactly the change in understanding, or the broadening of understanding, that we were hoping to be able to make with framing, to build support for more holistic policies and programmes, rather than people defaulting to individual responsibility and solutions that would sort of impact individual responsibility being the answer. So the framing strategies we used between these two clips successfully broadened this woman's view. We explained what causes food-related ill health, and this led her to think about different solutions as a result. And this idea of explaining how things happen using tested framing to do that is something we'll come back to today. Now, our research always starts by seeking to understand what mindsets people hold on a given issue. We want to know not just what people think, as I said earlier, but how all of us think. And this comes down to mindsets. Mindsets are deep patterns of thinking that sit below the level of opinion or talk, and they shape how we understand the world. They are implicit, they are shared, and they are enduring. And they're activated and strengthened by the things that we see and hear every day, whether that's stories we read in the paper, things we see on TV, the content that we scroll through, the conversations we have, all of these narratives around us. So framing works when we're able to understand and then navigate these mindsets so that we can work to strengthen the ones that are going to be helpful in achieving positive social change and avoid the ones that are unproductive. And over time, this can really make changes to how we all see, how we think about different issues, the solutions we're likely to support. But it also means that here and now we can have conversations starting in the place where we want to start so that we can actually get to those solutions and find that place of understanding. So framing has the power to help us both here and now and in the long term, shifting mindsets. So when it comes to talking about homes, our research surfaced these ways of thinking as some of the obstacles which we need to overcome when we're talking about homes. Now, we've covered these mindsets in some depth in previous webinars, so I'm just going to draw out a couple of them today that I think are most pertinent when we're thinking about homes and poverty together. They very much cross over. So first of all, individualism. So this is that mindset of how we do in life really coming down to individual drive, whether we work hard, whether we have willpower, whether we will do what we need to do to succeed. And when it comes to homes, the way that we saw this coming out in people's thinking was this idea that, well, if you're living in a home that's not meeting your needs, or you can't afford to live in a home that meets your needs, the solution to that is that you as an individual really need to work harder or find a higher paying job. That's what it comes down to, because you're thinking about this through that lens of individualism. Similarly, when it comes to our research on poverty, we found this mindset of individualism very much playing a part in how people thought about, reasoned about the issue, and how that limited the solutions that were front of mind for people. Again, this idea of people needing to strive their way out of poverty being fairly front of mind. The second mindset I want to draw our attention to is fatalism. So this is that sense of a problem being too big to solve, too complex, too entrenched. And the result of that is it can feel that, well, there's not really any point in trying because how could we possibly change things? I think that mindset speaks for itself as why that would be a problem when we're advocating for change. But there's much that we can do to sidestep it and to overcome it. And we'll be looking at some different strategies today that we can use to both counter individualism and fatalism. Now, you'll have also heard me say before, if you've been in one of our previous webinars, that we found some very productive ways of thinking, which we absolutely can bolster with the right framing that we can bring to the fore rather than triggering these less helpful ideas which tend to be more front of mind. So there are ways that we can bolster helpful mindsets. There are ways that we can fill in gaps in people's understanding too, so that they don't default to these mindsets to fill in the gaps. Now, the reason that we hold these webinars, that it's great to see so many of you join us today, is that this takes a lot of us working together. Often messaging on an issue can look a bit like what's on screen, so lots of different people and organisations sharing different things in different ways. And if you're somebody listening from the outside, it can be very hard to hear a clear signal through all of that noise, to draw a kind of consistent understanding about what we need to understand about this issue. But when lots of us draw on the same frames, the same communications principles, it can start to feel much more like this. So think of framing as a scaffolding which a whole sector can use to structure communications. You can still tailor communications to your audiences, you can dial different elements up or down, you can layer this with your own insights, but it's about fundamentally trying to use the same underpinning ideas. We don't all have to say the same thing in the same way, but when we use framing to support the same overarching story, we can shift understanding in the same direction, which makes it much more likely for us to build understanding and for some kind of change to take hold. Now, these are the framing strategies which we identified through our research on talking about homes and which you'll find in our toolkit, which we've been sharing through our webinars and workshops. I'm not going to take you through these again today, apart from a really brief recap now, just so you've got a reminder to keep in your head. And if you're new to these, I do urge you to take a look at the toolkit or look back at some of our previous sessions to gain a deeper understanding. But first of all, we found it very helpful to use this strategy of really talking about homes as a health issue, talking about those connections between our homes and how that impacts our health and well-being. Secondly, we found this helpful metaphor talking about homes as a foundation for a decent life. When we use this metaphor, it builds an understanding of how essential homes are and why quality is important. It's not just any foundation, it needs to be a firm foundation. Thirdly, we found it was helpful to invoke people's sense of moral responsibility. This shared value was helpful for making, sort of establishing a shared reason to care, essentially. Fourth, this one's perhaps there's more to unpick here in this recommendation, but we found it was very helpful, as it is in all cases, to really explain the solutions, particularly when it comes to housing. We found there just wasn't great understanding of what policies, what solutions could change things for the better. But interestingly, we found it was also helpful to combine this with a sort of critical tone that's sort of pointing to how we got here, how have there been perhaps failures in policy that mean that we now need to change things. So being able to sort of combine this more sort of critical tone with explanations of solutions to tackle fatalism, but acknowledge that things need to change. And last, we found it was important to really put any individual stories of people's lived experience of housing into context so that we're zooming out and we're looking at not just individual experience, but where that sits within the wider system. So do keep these in mind as we go through today. But what we're going to basically do today together is to look at how we can add to that set of strategies. It's not about replacing them, it's about kind of extending your arsenal of different framing strategies. And I would encourage you today to basically take a look at what feels most relevant and useful to your work. Take what serves you, take what works for you and what you're working on. And I hope this will help you to tell a more joined up story about homes and poverty. So our first recommendation is to really explain how poverty happens. And this is where I've got some insights to share with you from our latest Moving Mindsets report. We first explored mindsets on poverty and wealth almost a decade ago with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. And what we found back in 2016 is there was this mindset of post-poverty that really dominated public thinking. So this is the assumption that in the UK, as a prosperous society, true poverty only really exists in other countries, not here and not now. In 2016, we had to first prove that poverty existed and caused harm before we could advocate to end it. Now, as we move into 2025, that mindset has shifted. Poverty in the UK is not a contested idea anymore. It's understood to exist both here and now. Our focus groups were shaped by a newly identified mindset, which we're calling poverty creeps upwards. And this is the assumption that poverty is a real and growing threat in the UK. The idea that past guarantees of stability, like employment or class, are no longer necessarily enough. And for those of us working to tell different stories about poverty, this mindset is a double-edged sword. It does provide an alternative to the idea that real poverty is elsewhere or only affects other people. It does reflect the very real precarity felt by many of us across the UK. But there's something missing here, in that it fails to account for how poverty happens and who is most at risk. In those focus groups, people drawing on the poverty creeps upwards mindset tended towards zero-sum thinking, focusing first on their own and loved ones' risk of poverty. So if we activate this mindset without an explanation of where and why poverty is increasing, it can leave room for people to turn inward and to reject support being targeted towards those most affected by poverty. Essentially, the existence of poverty is no longer contested. That's good news, but it means that we do need to focus on how poverty happens and what we can do about it. Communications can quickly and concisely activate this idea of poverty is happening here and now, which means that if we have limited time and resources, we can direct those towards building a public understanding of how poverty happens and what we can do about it. And we have some framing strategies to help you do just that. So one way that we can explain how poverty happens, how it acts on people, how it shapes lives, what it feels like to be impacted by poverty, is to use the restricts and restrains metaphor. This helps to show how people can get locked in poverty, how it restricts people's options and opportunities. It can also be used to talk about solutions, which we will come on to shortly. A second metaphor that enables people to see how poverty happens and its effects is this idea of currents. So this powerful visual metaphor works in a similar way to restricts and restrains. It makes outside forces and their impact an unavoidable feature of poverty. It was designed to counteract people's belief that solving poverty is simply a matter of individuals opting to work harder and make better choices. In the same way that an individual can't simply swim against strong currents, we need to look beyond individuals for the solutions to poverty. So we need to look at what supports should be put in place and strengthened. That's the helpful work that this metaphor can do, the understanding that it can build. And we can use it flexibly. We could talk about channels, we could talk about tides, we could talk about being swept up, pulled along, pulled under. We could also alternatively talk about what we can do to help people stay afloat, how we can work upstream. So an example here of how we might use this. So instead of saying something like this example on the left, the rising cost of living is putting more and more people in the UK in the shadow of poverty. As rents continue to rise, it's impossible for many of us to make ends meet. We could instead say more of us are being pulled into the rising tide of poverty as a result of low wages and high rents. We must make changes to help people stay afloat. So here we're using that metaphor to helpfully build that understanding of poverty as this kind of external force that acts on us. We're also highlighting how it's coming about by actually talking about things like low wages and high rents. And you could use other examples here as well to make your point. Our next recommendation is for those of you working to advocate for more social homes, really explain how social homes prevent poverty and hardship. We found this to be helpful for boosting support for building more of them, but we do need to explain how this works. When people understand our points, when they really see where we're coming from, they're far more likely to agree with us. When we explain, it's like showing our workings. It leads people to the same conclusion rather than just expecting people to take our word for it. So let's take a look at what happened in our research when we were testing different ways that we could frame the need for more social homes. So what we're looking at here is essentially three different issue frames. Issue frames establish what a topic is really about. So for example, we could say that social housing is at its core about reducing poverty. We could say social housing should be considered first and foremost as being about supporting our economy or improving our country's health. And we tested those three frames to see which ones made the most difference when it came to policy support, that support for building more social housing. There's, of course, many different dimensions to the issue, but we wanted to know what's the most helpful one to really lead with to open up how people think about social homes. And when we tested health, poverty, and the economy, we found that both the poverty and health issue frames were effective in increasing people's support for policies to build more social housing. Those asterisks there are showing that these were statistically significant changes, and whereas making the economic argument, it didn't make a significant difference. It didn't do harm, but it wasn't making a significant difference. If you've joined a previous webinar or read our toolkit, you'll know the importance of making this connection between our homes and our health. But as you can see here, in the case of social homes, specifically, explaining how social homes prevent poverty is also a helpful framing strategy. So let's take a look at how we can apply this. As I said, when people understand our point, they're far more likely to agree with it. So as well as explaining how poverty happens, as in the previous recommendation, explaining what we can do about it is important so that we can avoid triggering those unproductive mindsets like fatalism and individualism. If we make a statement like this, social homes prevent poverty and hardship, without explaining how social homes prevent poverty and hardship, we're taking a risk. Because we know that people are likely to fill in gaps in understanding with the most dominant mindsets. And in this case, that's likely to be something like this. So does working harder, relying on that mindset of individualism. But when we explain step by steps, we can fill in the gaps in people's understanding. We can walk people through how social homes prevent poverty and hardship. We can take them with us. So we could say something like this: social homes can prevent people from becoming trapped in poverty, because they are the only type of housing where rents are linked to local incomes. So this helps to keep rent affordable and stops people's incomes from being squeezed. So the solution is building more social homes, which would relieve this pressure for many more people. Now, in this example, I've been really explicit about the links between cause and effect. This may sound obvious, but using words like because, this means, so, this leads to, this results in, really helps to weave together your explanation and point to those connections. Back to our restricts and restrains metaphor, see how we can also use this to talk about solutions. So in this case, social homes. For example, we could say social homes help to release people from the constraints of poverty. Social homes unlock opportunities for people to X, Y, Z. Social homes can help to loosen poverty's grip. And you could find much more ways to flex this as well. That's just 3 ideas to get you started. And you could use this metaphor as part of a fuller explanation like on the previous slide, but even by itself, it's going to be starting to explain how this works. It's going to help to prompt a better understanding of the impact of poverty and the impact of solutions, talking about poverty as a force or pressure which can be lessened by more social homes for people who need them. An example here, again, of how this could work in practice, we could say having the solid foundation of a social home is essential for people who are struggling under the weight of poverty. An affordable place to call home relieves the pressure on people's lives and on their mental health too. So see here how I've kind of explained that connection between social homes and poverty, how social homes can relieve the pressure for people experiencing poverty. I've also woven in health. So there have been many cases where you can actually bring these two together. You don't necessarily have to choose one or the other. And you can do this as part of sort of fuller explanation as well. On to our third recommendation for today. And now we're going to take a look at social security specifically. And our recommendation is to really talk about what social security can and should do if you're advocating for it within your work. So we saw in our talking about poverty research that when we talk about social security, there is a tendency for people to start thinking about who is deserving or undeserving. There can also be a tendency to overlook welfare as part of the solution to solving poverty, or to even see it perhaps as part of the problem instead. So we need to remind people that that benefits are part of a wider system of public services that we all rely on. And you could describe things like housing benefit and universal credit as support that people draw on when they need it. This is helpful to overcome that sense of kind of othering, making this just really part of this wider system of public services that are there for all of us as and when we need it. The next thing I'd recommend here is to use metaphor wisely. So I often hear people referring to benefits, welfare, social security, whatever term you use, but referring to those as a safety net. Now, the problem with safety net is that it can unhelpfully prime people to think of welfare as a last resort or a temporary measure, something that catches people when they fall, rather than something that actually has the power to pull people out of poverty. So instead, I'd recommend trying a metaphor like lifeline, which could also be combined with that metaphor of currents that we covered earlier. Or try extending the restricts and restrains metaphor with ideas like unlocking poverty's constraints and loosening its grip. Now, something else to share is that when we frame social security as a solution, when we talk about what it can and should do, we shift people's thinking in helpful directions. So what we found in our framing research on poverty is that when we talk about what social security can and should do, when we frame it in this way of talking about it as part of the solution, there's really boosted helpful understanding about context, about collective responsibility, and a sense that if we act, we can all make a difference. Now, to bring this to life with an example of what I mean by problem versus solution when it comes to talking about benefits, this first example says the benefit system is broken and must be fixed. Benefits are vital for people in poverty, including those who work, and we need to stop cutting benefits so the system is fit for purpose. So you can see there we've said that part of the problem is that we need to fix benefits. Now, while that may well be the case, it's going to actually build much more helpful understanding if we instead talk about what benefits can do, what they should do, what they would do if we were to make sure the system worked well. So we could say something like this example on the right. We can solve poverty by loosening the constraints our economy places on people. Benefits are a key part of freeing people from these constraints. And of course, you could elaborate on this, but it's a short example of how we can kind of flip that reframing from problem and solution. The second example also nods more towards how benefits would actually help. It shows what a system that's fit for purpose should look like. Now let's look at how we could bring all of these three recommendations together into a fairly short paragraph still. It could look something like this. We could say things like low wages and rising living costs create currents that can pull people into poverty. And sometimes things happen that threaten to pull us under, like losing a job, coping with disability, or leaving our home to get out of an abusive relationship. So we need a benefit system that anchors people so they don't get pulled into the current and pushed into poverty. And we need more genuinely affordable social homes to relieve the pressures of poverty and provide a strong foundation for many more people to thrive. So see there how I've drawn on the different recommendations that we've covered today, talking about how poverty happens, using that currents metaphor to do that, talking about how the benefit system should work, that idea of anchoring people, and then also talking there about how social homes are part of the solution, how they can relieve the pressures of poverty. So how do they work? How do they prevent poverty? Now, you don't have to bring them all together like this. You can choose what's going to work best for you, depending on what you're trying to communicate, what your aims are. But you can use these together, and you can see that this is also working hand in hand with some of those recommendations from our existing toolkit, woven in the foundation metaphor, for example, there. So we've covered three ways that you can tell a joined up story about homes and poverty, things that you can add in to your sort of wider toolkit of framing principles that you can draw on. We've looked at that importance of explaining how poverty happens, because we have seen this really helpful shift in understanding, but there's still a bit more work to do there so that people really understand how poverty comes about, therefore what we can do about it. talking about what we can do about it. We've looked at how it's important to explain how social homes prevent poverty and hardship and some strategies we can use to do that. And we've also looked at that idea of talking about what social security can and should do. And again, a few different principles that you can put into practice for doing this. So hopefully you'll come away from today feeling a bit less like the sort of disparate arrows and a bit more like this. And again, a reminder that this is about drawing on the same ideas, but you can still absolutely be flexing these different principles to work for your own communications aims, your audiences, working alongside other insights you already have, your own organizational tone, all of those things. These are ideas, they are not fixed forms of messaging. I'd encourage you to think about how you can use them in ways that really work for you. The important thing is that we're drawing on that same overarching story, the same frames, rather than the same content necessarily, to really build that helpful understanding. Now, we'll go to questions in just a moment, but first, just a quick plug. If you have just watched this and thought, I wish X, Y, and Z and my team had been here today, obviously you can signpost people towards the recording, which will be shared after today's session. We're also going to be doing a very similar session with our friends over at the Chartered Institute of Housing in a few weeks' time. I think Natalie will pop a link in the chat for anybody who'd like to sign up for that, if you'd like to share that link around. So we've been doing a few sessions with the Chartered Institute of Housing. This is open not just to their members, but to everybody. So kindly hosting this in an open fashion to really spread the word. So this session with them will be very similar to what we've done today. So you don't need to come to both unless you'd like to, but do definitely share the link with anybody who'd like to join and be able to ask questions afterwards rather than just watching the recording. But that's enough from me, and I'd love to hear from you and any questions that you've got for me. I'm going to just stop sharing my screen so that I can see Kate when she emerges for the Q&A.
Hello, Sophie. Thank you very much for that. We've got a couple of questions in, and I know what tends to happen is they start to flood in once we start the Q&A. So we'll get going with a couple of the ones that have been asked in the meantime. Abby's asked a great question. I think that's really important to address live, which is saying, how do you balance using these framing recommendations, such as the metaphors, for example, with the desire to keep it simple for people, to use really accessible language?
It's a great question, and one that comes up quite a lot. And I'd say I kind of have two answers to this. So firstly, I'd say that actually often metaphors are absolutely doing that for us. They're actually breaking down really complex or abstract concepts and making them very immediate and tangible. That's why we recommend them, because actually they can be so helpful in that way. And often, though I say metaphor, we're often using them actually more in a simile form. We're saying this is like that, sort of making that comparison, which can also, if you have that concern about accessibility of perhaps being too literal with the metaphor, I'd encourage you to maybe use it in that way, because then when it's a comparison, it's a bit clearer what that is being used for in your communications. But secondly, I would say that if you feel that it's not right for the audience you're talking to, you do not have to use metaphors, but you can still sort of use the spirit of them. What we're ultimately saying is it's important to explain, and there'll be other ways that you can explain. You can use that kind of step-by-step type of technique that we covered today. You can just make sure that you're filling in gaps. But yes, I'd say that often people are a bit concerned about the sort of accessibility of our metaphors. I would say we haven't explicitly tested them with sort of different learning disabilities, for example, but we do test them with a nationally representative sample of the UK, which will take into account different reading levels, etc. as well.
Yeah, and the way you've expressed some of these ideas today, Sophie, is just one version, right? So many different ways of doing it. And it's the idea, not the specifics of the language that really counts, isn't it? Next question we've got in is about if we can use personal stories to enliven the case for change. And do you have any tips around doing that?
We absolutely can. And in fact, we find that this is often a really powerful way of humanizing the issues that we're talking about. It can be very easy to start sort of reducing when we're talking about housing need to numbers. And actually, it's very important to remember that there's people behind those numbers. So this is something that we've talked to a bit more in our previous sessions. Essentially, what we'd recommend when telling any individual stories is just making sure that we're also zooming out. If we're not careful, what we can see when it comes to telling stories is a sort of possibly triggering that individualism mindset, or sort of leaving people maybe with the impression that this could be written off as an exceptional case, a one-off case. So there's some very simple things we can do to overcome that, which is just simply kind of adding context, adding scale. So maybe you're telling one person's story, but you could talk about how this is indicative of a much bigger number of people experiencing a similar issues. You could add context of the sort of policies or the lack of supports that have maybe led to somebody's story in their situation. You can also ask people who are telling their stories, actually ask them questions that prompt them to bring out this context and scale themselves. Ask people things like, what support did you have, or what support would have made a difference? And then quite quickly, what we actually start to get to there are the wider sort of systems of support, or the lack of that, which sit around people. And so we're basically using an individual story to tell a more systemic story. And the other thing that we can do is make an effort to sort of across a sector or across an organization's communications do tell diverse stories. So sort of shared experiences, but from diverse voices. And that can do a similar job as well to kind of avoid any of this being written off as exceptional. When we are actually hearing from multiple people expressing their experiences in different ways, but pointing to similar problems, that's in its own way also a chorus of voices that's very much pointing to the change that we want to see.
One of our participants is putting on an immersive arts event, and one of the things they want to do in that is to help people understand the increase in poverty and maybe bust some myths around it. What advice would you have for them in doing this kind of work?
So I would say, similarly, do think definitely about how you can sort of widen that lens. So sort of context and scale, depending on the sort of form that their art project's taken. It sounds fascinating. I mean, I'd love to see this. Do sort of think about, perhaps if it's one person's experience, think about where you could add that context and scale. When it comes to busting myths, that's sort of piqued my kind of it's like kind of bell in my head about myth busting, which is just to make sure that in busting myths, you're maybe not inadvertently reinforcing the very myths that you're trying to bust. So what I mean here is that we've seen in multiple studies very well-meaning communications that sort of employ this technique of myth busting, where it might say, you know, it's a myth that poverty doesn't exist in the UK. This is actually the case. The problem with that is actually we have stated a myth in a way that lodges in our brain, and that means that sort of over time that can often be sort of misremembered as actually the fact, and that can get worse over time as well. So it might be that you're talking about myth busting more sort of widely, but if you were considering using that particular technique, I would say always sort of try to instead, you know, say what it is, not what it isn't. So instead of stating the myth in order to rebut it or to bust it, actually say, you know, poverty is still here and now. It's a very real and present issue in the UK. That would do a better job of busting the myth than stating the myth to bust it, if that makes sense.
Sophie, a number of different questions that are really about who are the right or audiences for this approach to talking about homes and poverty. So, for example, we're talking about general public audience or policymakers. Similarly, does it work with faith communities or with people with direct experience of the issues that we're talking about? So, can you say something about audiences?
Yes, absolutely. So with all of our research frameworks, the reason that we start with mindsets is we want to actually see those shared understandings, those shared reasonings that work across audiences so that we can actually do good work to move everybody in the same direction. So that's why we do really big nationally representative surveys, and as well as involving diverse groups of people within our focus groups, our peer discourse sessions, in order to get to the things we recommend today. And so, yes, general public, absolutely for this work. What we're hoping to see is actually shifting public discourse, which in turn can shift many things, can shift political will, etc. And so that's why we're really interested in making this, all of these messages, these frames are out there loud and clear for everybody to hear, but also specific audiences, because we've so far not met a policymaker that isn't also a human being. They will also share these mindsets. Now, you might also have specific insights about a particular audience, but I would encourage you to always layer them on top of framing strategies instead of sort of picking one or the other, because really framing works best when it's consistent and used over time. And in fact, particularly when it comes to some of our research here on framing poverty, we have been using it over time and we have been seeing positive changes as a result of that. These concerted efforts by campaigners are one of the reasons why we're seeing this shift. And we have seen policy wins in this space as well, which has been bolstered by that helpful framing by campaigners. Oh, there was a last part of that question, Kate, that's gone out of my head, but I definitely had an answer to it.
It was different audiences, so maybe people with direct experience.
Direct experience. That was it. So, and also this can be very helpful actually in working with people with direct experience. That was a very big part of the work we did with JRF on talking about poverty. There was actually quite a lot of co-creation work done with people with lived experience. And what many people with lived experience told us was that these framing strategies could give voice to the experiences that they felt. It gave them the tools to communicate and to know that what they wanted to get across was actually being heard in the way they intended. So it meant that they were sort of bringing their experiences. We were able to provide tools that meant that they could make sure that people were really hearing them in the way they intended. So absolutely, I would encourage you to consider sharing this if you're doing any work with people with lived experience, as we've had feedback in the past that it can really be helpful.
Great, thank you. Sophie, a couple of questions about whether we can apply these framing recommendations to specific aspects of the challenge of homes or of poverty. So, for example, applying it to housing benefit or to child poverty. Are there any particular watch outs or things to bear in mind when thinking about those two?
So I'd say when it comes to housing benefit, that's absolutely why I wanted to include some recommendations today around how we talk about social security. Everything that I said today about social security, I would consider looking at how you could weave that into how you talk about housing benefit. So definitely apply it there. And when it comes to child poverty, similarly, I think it might be particularly helpful to draw on that kind of how poverty happens and what it is like to be experiencing poverty, maybe drawing on that restricts and restrains metaphor, how this might really sort of limit opportunities for a child, for example. So perhaps that could be one of the strategies from today that might be most useful, particularly in that space.
Great, thanks. Some people have asked whether the recommendations you made are specific to talking about social homes, or is it to homes more broadly?
So the sort of the recommendations that are in our Talking About Homes toolkit, I would say apply to homes more broadly. So whether you're talking about social homes, private renting, affordable homes more broadly, all of that. So definitely those are the sort of broader recommendations there. I'd say when making the second recommendation I shared today, which was about talking about how social homes prevent poverty and hardship, that is specific to social homes. So that is, we did a discrete piece of research as part of the wider Talking About Homes project that looked more particularly at framing social homes. And that's possibly the sort of one recommendation that stands out to me as being kind of different to what ended up in the wider Talking About Homes toolkit. But as I showed today, you could still sort of combine that with the wider recommendations we have for talking about homes. But for example, if I was trying to make some communications about reforming private renting, I wouldn't draw on those framing recommendations on how social homes prevent poverty and hardship, unless ultimately that will only make the case for social homes used in that way. But there'll be other aspects of the framing we've talked about today, such as the metaphor like restricts and restrains. You could absolutely apply that in a private renting context, for example, sort of highlighting how that's why it's such an issue. We have rising rents and no real controls on them because that's further squeezing people's incomes, for example. So kind of yes and no.
So we just want to dig down into a little bit more granular detail before we zoom back out again for some more questions. But one of the questions is about the specifics of some language. So, for example, um, do what we mean by social homes, does it matter? Do we have to define it every time? And similarly around the term affordable, which is often bandied about but isn't well understood. Anything
Mm.
on those specific terms before we zoom back out again?
Yeah, and that's a great question. It's one that when we've previously done workshops looking at social homes and affordability more specifically, we've definitely drawn these out as recommendations. So I'm pleased you've asked. I would definitely say that where we can, it's helpful to include a short definition of what we mean by social home, social housing, because even if people were perhaps more familiar with a term like council housing, people often still don't actually really understand what it is, how it works, what would sort of qualify as social housing. So it is helpful, even just in a sentence, to just say what they are, to make sure that you've not got that kind of missed opportunity to build understanding. And similarly, when it comes to affordability, we saw in our research that people understood this idea of affordability as being based on what you can personally afford. So it being kind of each to their own, kind of, I guess, being understood through that lens of the individualism mindset. So if what you're really talking about, you're advocating for a sort of greater, a more specific definition of affordability that's linked to income, for example, do you spell that out? Or, put it within the context of you might talk about social homes being genuinely affordable because the rent is linked to income, for example. So basically, yes, do spell things out when you can. It doesn't necessarily have to be an exhaustive explanation, but just making sure you're saying something so you can anchor people's understanding.
So to zoom back out again, one of the questions we've had is about how do you get people to care at all, like in the first place, before we get into this detail, before we make the case, how do you even get people to care about this issue?
Mm. So I would say that first of all, I am heartened from our research. I think actually people often they do care, and actually we saw quite a high baseline of support for the sort of changes we're talking about here, like building more social homes. So I actually think we are. While all of us are busy, and often that in itself is just, it's getting people's attention before we can get into care. Actually, I do think there's a great opportunity than we might sometimes feel. So a positive there to begin with. And secondly, I would say to get people to care, I would probably most be looking at things like our recommendations on values frames. So in the case of housing, it's kind of invoking that sense of moral responsibility, the idea that it's not right, that our housing system is currently failing so many people, and that we could absolutely make changes for the better. And while it's more of an issue frame than a values frame, I do think that connection between homes and health is very helpful for this kind of shared reason to care as well, because it's essentially kind of humanizing the impact of homes. It's this idea of really reminding us how that can shape our lives every day. And while we're talking about homes, actually using that word homes in itself, it's connecting to people to what home really means, that kind of sense of all those less tangible things that make us feel secure. So there's a few things we can draw on there to really be talking in a way that is more likely to connect with people on the making them care level. So anything we can do to humanize, but do take a look at those recommendations in the broader Talking About Homes toolkit to help with that too.
Yeah, and maybe one more just to flag now, which is a really basic, simple one, but people will notice that Sophie's consistently talking about homes. She's not talking about housing. And I think that's one of, whilst the noun refers to bricks and mortar, is actually humanizing insofar as when most people talk about the place they live, they talk about their home, not their housing. And brings in that human dimension that I think brings it humanizes the whole conversation, and is done very deliberately. Um, and Paul is asking, is there something in this about getting people to see people rather than problems or issues? And I think that's absolutely what you've just been talking about, isn't it, Sophie?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I would add to that as well, wherever, and I'm sure that people on the call already be doing this, but people first language. So, for example, always, people experiencing homelessness, never the homeless, just making people first and foremost part of the message is going to be helpful for that as well.
Yeah. Somebody has been asked if Frameworks offers specific advice on campaigns or activities so that to apply these recommendations to practice. The answer is absolutely yes. You can get in touch with us via our website and follow that up. We're happy to offer that kind of guidance. Sophie, there's some questions about misinformation and what's the role of framing in the context of misinformation. Um, and I think allied to that, somebody else has asked about coming back to the question of myth busting, that sometimes myths are so strongly believed, whether they're myths, so they're not true, but they're so strongly believed that you can't not address them and stay credible. So was there anything you wanted to add on that?
Yes, absolutely. And I would say that I think the question is almost like alluding to this, the way I would tackle that, which is to sometimes we do need to address them head on, but just the way that we do it, I think it's very easy actually to address a myth without repeating it. And instead of not just saying that's not true, actually just say what is true, and do that in a compelling way that is well framed. So, for example, if I think about, I think a couple of years ago now, actually, where there was the kind of unhelpful headlines coming out of some people in Parliament about homelessness being a choice, a lifestyle choice, and the way that you can sort of address something like that, for example, instead of saying it's not a lifestyle choice, you could say this is a political choice. Look at the policies that have been put in place or not put in place, and actually tackling it in that way, for example, is very much, directly addressing something that's been said, but it's, pivoting it to what you really want to say about the issue. And there'll be many different ways you can do that. But essentially, it's about giving oxygen to the thing you want people to take away. But you're not shying away from addressing what has been said that needs to be corrected.
So you're saying what something is, as opposed to repeating what it isn't,
Yes.
making the positive case. Sophie, I think that's probably all we've got time for in terms of questions. There are plenty of other questions, but many of them are probably too long to get into in the couple of moments or the minute we have left.
Yes, and I would say if there's anything, particularly getting into some of the nitty-gritty that you'd really just like to unpick a bit more, that's why we have Talking About Homes is an ongoing project. We're working with JRF, the Nationwide Foundation. You can reach out to us via our Frameworks website, frameworksus.org.uk, but also getting in touch. You'll have seen Natalie in the chat today, and Natalie and I can work with you, particularly on certain materials where you would just really like to actually maybe show them to us and be able to get some more specific feedback and input. So lots of different ways that you can pick up the conversation if we've not managed to get to any questions today. But for now, I will leave it there. I'm conscious it's a very hot day and some of you might be slowly melting, so I'm definitely not going to go over the hour. Thank you for joining us, and do look out for the follow-up email, which will have a few helpful resources for you, including the recording if you need to share that around anywhere else. But thanks very much for joining today, and we'll hopefully see you at a future webinar soon as well. Bye for now.